the last character in the book, Leyla Wydler, she is not she's an American broker. She is not facing war. She is not in the middle of an ethnic conflict, but she is in the middle of a fraud, and she senses that a financial fraud is being perpetrated by the company she's been hired by. She gets fired, as I mentioned. She writes to the SEC and she writes to the media, to the Washington Post and other newspapers, sending them financial reports. And in a letter she says, you know, this is right after the Enron scandal, 2003. She says, I fear another major scandal is happening. You know, I would like someone to call attention to this so investors' money can be saved. No one responds. She goes to arbitration. She's forced to pay back the bonus that Stanford gave her. She's ostracized from the industry. She goes through a couple of years of hell. And it only 2009, 6 years later, when Stanford's Ponzi scheme finally implodes, is she finally given some recognition that, yes, indeed, this was true.
You know, for those of us who have had any occasion to follow Madoff and/or Stanford, the SEC knew that Stanford was a Ponzi scheme in the early 2000s. There are memos that, well, there's probably a Ponzi scheme, but somebody else has jurisdiction, so we're going to ignore it.
That's right.
You know, anybody, it's enough to make me a right-wing, rock-ribbed Republican. Government is a disaster some of the time.
You're right. In fact, the memos said things like, described the returns at Stanford as absolutely ludicrous, and said, you know, probably Ponzi scheme or maybe Ponzi scheme, years before anyone acted on it. The government failed, but let's not isolate the government, because the industry regulation, FINRA and so forth, they also failed. Yeah. So allowing this industry to self-police itself is a guarantee and a recipe.
And the media were telling the media that
that's right.
Wrong.
And one thing I really do want to drive home in the book is that when we read about these stories of people like Leyla Wydler, who took the risk and suffered the consequences of speaking out, we can ask ourselves two questions. One is, well, what would I have done in that situation? Would I have been courageous enough? And a lot of people, if they're being honest, say, well, you know, maybe not. Maybe I would have worried about my job. But there's another question, which is, what would I have done if I heard about Leyla Wydler? If I heard about that there was some kind of Ponzi scheme going on? And the thing that I think we're all responsible for is paying attention to these voices, these people who take risks, rather than instinctively turning away or being apathetic. Because if more people had taken these warnings seriously, there were insiders who were saying this, both with Madoff and with Stanford, and indeed with some of the housing you know, shenanigans that were going on. So one message of the book is really that the responsibility begins by paying attention. And that doesn't take a hero to do that. It takes a citizen.
This excerpt is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law, the leader of reform in legal education and a leader in multimedia education for the public. To view the full interview and for a full listing of MSL's programs, log on to mslaw.edu.